Very warm welcome to Japan House, London. My name is Sam Thorne. I'm Director General here. We are broadcasting this evening's event on Zoom as well, so a warm welcome to our live online audience. We're very happy to be collaborating with the International Institute for Strategic Studies on this special and I think very timely conversation. We're very happy to be joined by such a distinguished panel. I'm going to be handing over to Robert Ward in a moment, but before I do, a few words of introduction to Japan House London for those of you who may not have visited before. We are the cultural home of Japan in London. We really aim to bring the very best of Japanese cultures to London, to the UK, and to Europe. We bring together the worlds of culture, of policy and politics, of business, retail, and food. And so we're really a hybrid organization. As you'll see this evening, we have an auditorium, we have a gallery, and I welcome you to explore the exhibition we have there at the moment called Wave. It will be open till 8:30. Do take a look. A shop, a restaurant, a library, and many other things besides. And we're celebrating our 5th birthday at the moment. And since opening back in 2018, we've welcomed 1.6 million people here to dozens of exhibitions and 1,000 events like this one. So we're very happy to be joined by all of you this evening and very happy to be focusing on this subject. I'm now going to be handing over to the chair of this discussion, Robert Ward. Robert is the IISS Japan Chair, carrying out independent research and writing extensively on strategic issues related to Japan. Robert also leads the Institute's Geoeconomics and Strategy Research Program. Please join me in welcoming this evening's panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam, and thanks for to Japan House, of course, for this fantastic venue. A very warm welcome to this International Institute for Strategic Studies event, which we've called the Japan-UK Strategic Partnership and Europe's Engagement in the Indo-Pacific. We're delighted to be hosting this event with the kind support of Japan House, of course, and the wonderful team that's been so supportive as well during the setting up of the event in London's Kensington. For those online, do drop by Japan House when you're next in London. There's absolutely tons of enticing stuff related to Japan to see here. I'm also pleased to say that we've got a global audience for this across the hemispheres, obviously the audience in person here and virtually, so a special thank you to those of you online who are getting up early or staying up late to listen to this session. As Sam said, I'm Robert Ward, and I'm the Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the IISS, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session. Given the intensity of global geopolitical fluidity since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, the Indo-Pacific theme of today's event could not be more timely. One important reason for this is that the Indo-Pacific is strategically closer than you might think to Europe. Indeed, Japan's Prime Minister Kishida Fumio linked European and Asian security in his now well-known statement that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow, which he made, by the way, during his keynote address in June 2022 at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. Increasing tensions around Taiwan, which sits astride one of the world's most important shipping routes, the evolving strategic relationship between China and Russia, Russia's rekindling of its security connections with North Korea, North Korea's ongoing WMD program. These are all examples of what Prime Minister Kishida meant in his statement. Japan feels these tensions acutely, of course, with China, Russia, and North Korea, all neighbors, directly so in the case of Russia. It's not surprising, therefore, that Japan has been playing a leading role in trying to support stability in the Indo-Pacific, focusing on upholding the rule of law, boosting its own deterrence and response capabilities alongside those of its US ally, and building coalitions of the like-minded. The UK and countries in the EU have been one focus of the latter. The deepening of Japan-UK strategic relations has been particularly noticeable, with this year alone the signing of the bilateral reciprocal access agreement, the UK-Japan Hiroshima Accord, and of course the UK's entry into the CPTPP trade bloc, in which Japan and the UK are by far the largest economies. Other countries in Europe, including France, Germany, and the Netherlands, have also been articulating their own Indo-Pacific strategies, again reflecting broader Japanese success, I think, in internationalizing the importance of the region. Audience, you are in for a real treat this evening with our dream panel, who will help us navigate some of these strategic eddies and currents in this critical region and explain, I hope, why the Indo-Pacific matters so much in Europe. So a brief introduction to our speakers in the order in which they will speak. First is Professor Mori Satoru. Satoru is Professor of Contemporary International Politics at the Faculty of Law at Keio University, but started his career in Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think you were saying at lunch, 1996 to 2001. Yes. His current intellectual focus is contemporary US foreign and defense policy with a focus on US strategy in Asia and US defense innovation and its implications for US allies. Satoru has also been looking at various Taiwan contingency scenarios. He participated in an excellent IISS Japan memo podcast at the end of last year on Japan's defense and security roles in the event of a Taiwan contingency. Satoru has also authored a number of books, including The Vietnam War and Alliance Diplomacy in Japanese, which was published in 2009, and which was awarded the 15th Hiroshi Shimizu Prize for Distinguished Academic Work from the Japan Association of American Studies. I can also highly recommend Satoru's chapter in a recently published book, also in Japanese, called War in Ukraine and Its Global Consequences, which looks at the US's response to the current war against Ukraine and the response during the run-up to Russia's invasion. Satoru has flown in from Tokyo to be with us this evening, and we've done our best to keep him perky and sharp all day. So a very warm welcome to London, Satoru.
Thank you.
So our second speaker is Professor Guibourg Delamotte, who is a one-person embodiment of the link between the Indo-Pacific and Europe, being a French and Australian dual citizen. Guibourg is also Professor of Political Science at the Japanese Studies Department of the French Institute of Oriental Studies in ELCO in Paris. Among other affiliations, Guibourg is also a research fellow with the French Research Institute on East Asia. Her fields of research are Japan's domestic politics and international relations, in which she is also widely published, including most recently one about Japan. I'm going to speak in French briefly here, Guibourg, so bear with me. And it's called Le Japon, un leader discret. That's the most stressful bit of this evening. Japan, a discreet leader. Guibourg is also a fluent Japanese speaker, having started learning the language at the tender age of 10. And Guibourg has come to Paris to be with us this evening, so a warm welcome to you, Guibourg. And finally, Bill Emmott. Bill is chair of the IISS Trustees and chair of the UK's Japan Society, as well as an independent commentator on global politics, economics, and business issues. Bill will also be known to many of you from his 13 years as editor-in-chief of The Economist newspaper. I had the privilege of overlapping with Bill at The Economist Group for much of this period. Bill also has a long and distinguished association with Japan, which started, I think I got this right, Bill, with his posting to Tokyo in the 1980s. 1983, with The Economist, and it includes his authoring of a number of books on Japan, including the iconic The Sun Also Sets, which came out in 1989, I think, and which was actually one of the first books I read on Japan while I was on the JET program in Kyushu, back in the late 80s, early 90s. A number of Bill's books have also appeared in Japanese. In 2016, Bill was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun Gold Rays with Neck Ribbon by the Japanese government for services to Japan-UK relations. And I think, Bill, you're now writing a book on the Indo-Pacific matters for the IISS, which will come out soon.
I think I am too.
Before I give the floor to Satoru, a couple of housekeeping points. Each speaker will speak for 5 to 8 minutes, after which they and I will have a joint discussion on the issues raised, and I'll then open the floor to questions from the audience. Audience, please state your affiliation when you ask your question, and I'll do my best to be a good chair and keep the whole thing to 1 hour. So without more ado, Satoru.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank IISS for having me at this event. Special thanks to Ward-san for inviting me to this event. And it's a real privilege to be able to be on this panel alongside Emmott-san and Guibourg-sensei. Today, I want to bring some Japanese perspectives into this Indo-Pacific, how Japan's trying to engage the Indo-Pacific region. And I want to start off by pointing out that there are 3 probably main strategic tasks for Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. Number one is basically deterring China's use of force to alter the status quo over Taiwan. The second strategic task is expanding diplomatic engagements toward Southeast Asia, or perhaps the so-called global South at large. And thirdly, keeping the United States engaged in the Indo-Pacific, particularly after the 2024 US presidential elections. So I think these are three main tasks. And I was initially planning to address three topics, but I think I'll probably run out of time by only addressing the Taiwan issue. So forgive me if I cannot address the Global South issue or the Southeast Asia issue and also the US issue. We can probably come back during the discussion session. So to start off with Taiwan, deterrence of China. When we talk about deterrence, we have to talk about capability and also intentions. And starting with the capability side, as many of you may know, the Japanese government issued the so-called three strategic documents in December 2022, the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the Defense Build-Up Plan. And through these three documents, the Japanese government outlined the basic policy of undertaking three basic lines of effort to bolster deterrence vis-a-vis China. One of the punchlines in the document was that Ukraine today could be Indo-Pacific tomorrow. And the three lines of effort that was outlined in these three documents was number one, bolstering Japan's own defense capabilities. And number two, well, they actually identified 7 different types of defense capabilities. I'm not going to go into the details, but we can maybe come back during discussions. And the second line of effort is strengthening the US-Japan alliance, which has been, undergoing significant change through the review process of these three documents. And thirdly, enhancing security cooperation with third countries like Australia and UK as well. So these are the three basic lines of efforts that Japan is currently undertaking. Now, bolstering defense capability obviously requires funding, and one of the big issues right now is, how do we fund these defense budget increase? I think a part of that is going to be funded by the tax increase, and this is going to be political heavy lifting for Prime Minister Kishida, but it's now being sort of postponed to 2024 or 2025. But the basic idea behind this effort is basically to sort of send a message to China that engaging in arms buildup, particularly given the fact that China has been pursuing the strengthening of theater range offensive capabilities, also known as A2AD or anti-access area denial capabilities, and also they're expanding their nuclear arsenal right now. The idea is to sort of send a message to China that this kind of arms buildup will be actually met by multinational balancing, and that arms buildup is not going to actually deliver, allow them to alter the status quo by through the threat to use force and so forth. So this is the basic challenge that Japan is facing. Now, I think there are two very difficult challenges that Japan is still facing, given these initiatives are now being undertaken. Number one is that Japanese self-defense force is very low on readiness. Readiness meaning that the operational tempo of the self-defense force has been low. We are very low on parts and also munitions. Based on one of the reportings, we only have like 60% of the missile interceptors that we are supposed to have for the ballistic missile defense. And Japan's air self-defense force needs to sort of take away parts from one aircraft and put it to another in order to keep the operations going and so forth. So that is the state of readiness that Japan's self-defense force is in. And over the next 5 years, the first step for the Japan's defense establishment needs to do is that they have to replenish all these shortages and insufficiencies that they are now facing. So if you compare the last National Defense Program guidelines, this is the predecessor to the National Defense Strategy, and compare it to the latest National Defense Strategy. And if you look at the appendix where they actually outline the order of battle for the self-defense force, it doesn't change much in terms of hardware, because they have to concentrate and fund all the necessary shortages and insufficiencies that the Japanese self-defense force is So all the new capabilities that they talk about, counter-strike capabilities, space capabilities, cyber capabilities, and all these new capabilities will probably take about a decade to actually come into operations. So that's one major challenge that Japan is facing right now, even in the face of, I think the three strategic documents did a brilliant job of coming up with what needs to be done. But quite frankly, I think there's much to do in order to actually arrive at the starting line. The second major challenge is that what happens if crisis erupts before we have these deterrent capabilities? I think it's very likely, I think it's likely that if there were ever to be, we don't want to see that happen, obviously, but if there were ever to be a crisis over Taiwan Strait, there is going to be much anticipation that both the United States and China will try to avoid escalation, particularly to the nuclear level, which means that we are likely to face a protracted conflict over Taiwan. And is there an exit strategy that could be viable for both the United States, Japan, and Taiwan in the face of a protracted conventional conflict? And quite frankly, I don't think there is actually a so-called theory of victory that would be viable if we face a sort of a Taiwan crisis over the next 5 to 10 years. And this is going to be a very, very difficult political decision for both the US president and the Japanese prime minister, because if they face a crisis and if they are forced to make a decision whether to intervene in Taiwan, whether it's be it a blockade or any other type of crisis, then they are going to ask their advisors about what's the game plan. And I think their military advisors will probably have to say, well, even if we were to intervene in this situation, it's likely that we will end up in pretty much the same place 5 or 10 years down the road. So, Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, would you like to intervene? And that's the kind of very difficult, tough decision that they will have to face if a crisis were to erupt. So the decisive decade, as they say, is very challenging strategically and also politically. So that's the capability side. On the intention side, I think both the US government, my sense is that both the US government and also the Japanese government are firm in their sort of determination to deal with any sort of China's action to alter the status quo over Taiwan. My worry is that whether the US public and the Japanese public is ready to face this kind of crisis. And quite frankly, I don't think we have enough public debate about how we should be dealing, how we should be responding to a Taiwan crisis. I have not really seen a poll in Japan asking the question, are you willing to risk your life to defend Taiwan? Would you be willing to support US operations to defend Taiwan, even by risking your life? I haven't really seen that kind of public opinion poll. But my sense is probably more than half of the Japanese public will probably say no at this point. I think they are very much worried that their lives would have to be sacrificed. Not only their economic wealth, but also their actual lives would be put at risk if there were to be a crisis and the government were to intervene. And so what needs to be done if the public cannot support the government's decision to respond to a Taiwan crisis? And obviously the Chinese will probably engage in information operations against Japan, trying to sort of inflame pacifist sentiments inside Japan by trying to make the public oppose the government's decision to resist Chinese aggression. And if there is a significant divide between the public reaction and the government's reaction, and if Japan somehow gets retaliated by China and there's casualties, I think the cabinet will have a very difficult time standing and continue. And if the cabinet were to fall, the succeeding cabinet will have to probably reverse its decision to support US operations and so forth. So that's a kind of scenario that could unfold if public resolve is not strong enough. So I really think right now, people have started to talk about, Taiwan contingency is Japan's contingency, but it's sort of discussed in a very narrow context. What kind of economic damage will we sustain, or how many lives will be lost as a result of getting into a conflict? and how many missiles will be fired at Japan and so forth. So that's a kind of a narrow context. And if there is this notion that Taiwan security is divisible from Japanese security, I think it's China is going to have an easy time trying to wage that kind of information operation, try to divide the Japanese public from the Japanese government. So what needs to be done is that, well, if that kind of scenario plays out, I think the Japanese government will not be able to sort of politically sustain Japanese support to US operations. And if that were to happen, and if Japan actually decides to opt out of that kind of operation, then China will have killed three birds with one stone, right? Because if Japan opts out, the US will not be able to wage effective operations to defend Taiwan. And if Taiwan sees that happen, then Taiwan's going to lose the resolve to resist that kind of aggression. So in that sense, I think Japanese public opinion is a sort of a center of gravity in a US, Japan, Taiwan coalition warfare to resist Chinese aggression. So public opinion in Japan is critical for dealing with any kind of Taiwan crisis. And in order to sort of change the public mindset, I think we need to kind of reframe the debate by asking this question: what would the world look like if Taiwan falls under Chinese control? And for Japan, I think Japan is going to oppose any change of the status quo by force. And China is going to try to use all economic means to pressure Japan to accept Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. And so if that kind of situation happens, then I think Japanese decision-making will be heavily pressured by China. And this is the emergence of Chinese regional hegemony. So Japanese independence and freedom as we know it is going to kind of dissipate gradually. And if that kind of mindset is there, I think there would be more sort of a stronger public resolve. I'm not saying that this is going to be a silver bullet solution, but I think there would be a sort of a firmer public opinion to kind of resist if the public has an understanding, Japanese public has an understanding, and probably the American public has an understanding that if this kind of, if China takes over control of Taiwan, it's going to significantly affect the future of Japan. And I think this kind of public debate needs to unfold, and that's one of the biggest challenges that Japan faces right now. I can also talk about diplomatic engagement towards Southeast Asia, and also maybe trying to get the US to engage the Indo-Pacific region, but I probably reached my time, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Satoru. That was a sobering start to the session. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of public opinion. That often gets lost, I think, in the debate when we focus on all the military issues. But a couple of things stood out in what you said: Japan's low readiness for any conflict. You talked about Taiwan conflict being protracted. No theory of victory of short term. Yeah, back to public opinion. So quite a lot. We will come back to Taiwan on absolutely in the questions. With that, over to you, Guibourg.
Thanks very much. Yes, public opinion is important. And once upon a time, I haven't checked the figures lately, but it used to be the case that the Japanese, when asked what they would do if Japan were attacked, they used to say, well, we'd cooperate in a pacifist way with the armed forces, or some of them actually, a majority used to say we'd leave the country. So that used to be a bit of an issue. So all the more so is Taiwan.
Yes, yes.
I would like to talk about, well, as Robert said, the Japan-UK relation has become extremely strong in the last few years. And it is striking when you, coming from France, where I'm based, to see the contrast between the results obtained by the French and the UK government, the British government, because really the starting point was similar in 2012. When Japan opened up and decided, actually under the Democrat administration, to establish links, so just a bit 2011, to start discussions with the UK and France to establish a greater intelligence cooperation, and that did happen to a certain extent, and greater industrial cooperation. That happened with the UK, not France. And since then, the relationship with the UK, as Robert was mentioning, has really grown steadily, and to the extent that it's become an enhanced strategic partnership, whereas the French one seems to be stalling a bit. So There are reasons for that. One is that, I mean, there's a paradox also, because perhaps I should say this from the start. I mean, the French have been providing extremely strong, a very strong deterrent, really, militarily. They have five regional commands in the Indo-Pacific. So, you know, the United Kingdom has been emphasizing that they were sending deploying two patrol vessels in the Indo-Pacific, and boasting that they'd be permanently deployed there, which is very good. But the French have got 2 million citizens to defend over there, and permanently deployed are 7 Southern to 8 Southern military forces. So, so if you compare on balance, the French have got 9 surveillance and patrol aircrafts, and they've got 5 frigates. So, you know, if you're going to look at the military side only, then the French overwhelmingly should appear as a convincing partner, determined to stay in the Pacific and really well established there to Japan. So why is it not the case? What's been happening? Well, there's been a lot of bad communication or political blunders on the part of, I believe, the French president, but for reasons that can be explained. I mean, he has it in mind to strengthen European strategic autonomy, bearing in mind the 2024 elections in America, and also, you know, changes, possible differences between Europe and the United States. And so the idea that the EU should be more autonomous is something he really strongly believes in. Also, with the war in Ukraine, he has tried to get China on our side to influence Russia, so not wanted to antagonize China. So this has reflected in his position, for instance, not to endorse the idea of a liaison office in Tokyo for NATO. And the Japanese have seen that as extremely antagonizing or disturbing. So, so the second aspect, I guess, is that to Japan, the UK has provided a better deterrent, provides a better deterrent, in spite of the fact that the French are so much more present militarily in the South Pacific in particular. So why is that? Well, the French are refusing to do precisely what the UK is doing. The UK to Japan really appears as a natural extension of its own alliance with the United States, as does Australia very much. Whereas the French are very keen on keeping NATO in the North Atlantic region, Japan has been expanding its own alliance with the United States into a global alliance, notwithstanding the fact that in the security treaties mentioned the Far East as a scope for the treaty. So this is absolutely, the idea of a geographical scope is something that Japan's been not oversensitive to. Mm-hmm. And also the UK, for many reasons, I mean, including the English language, including IISS, has got this image of being of consistency and of world reach, really, which Japan, I believe, is receptive to. The United Kingdom is also a member of something called the Five Defense Security Arrangements with Malaysia, Singapore, also a member of the Partners in the Blue Pacific with Australia, New Zealand, and most importantly is now involved in Orcas. But also why Orcas? Because the Five Eyes are behind, and that's such an important institution and displays such a strong link with the United States. So for all those reasons, well, the UK appears as a very attractive partner to Japan, a very stable one in the long run, which the French do not. So what I'd like to emphasize, however, is that the security architecture is becoming a concentric circles based one, and we see that for all the fora which discuss security issues, be it the G7, where we now see where Japan invited the chair of ASEAN, the chair of the Pacific Islands Forum, Australia, many countries, Quad moving to a Quad Plus with South Korea, with Vietnam, NATO, where Australia and New Zealand are now invited with Japan. So we see all these regional groupings having concentric circles, and because it seems more and more relevant, really. And Orcas, likewise, is very likely, for that reason, to evolve into a concentric circles-based organization, or agreement. And it would make sense for France and Japan to find some way of cooperating in that framework with the United States and Australia and the UK. So that's what I'm hoping for. But indeed, consistency is very important in terms of for partners to understand where France comes from, and better communication, I think, is really important.
Thank you, Guibourg. You reminded us of France's significant, you called it militarily present in the region, and it's good to get some data on that. Interesting that you talk about Japan-UK relations moving more quickly than those of Japan and France. I'm sure we'll come back to that in questions. And also your comment on Orcas and the concentric circles have piqued my interest. So we'll definitely come back to that as well. So thank you. And Bill.
Well, thank you very much, and very kind of you to have me here, and delighted to be with two such excellent fellow panelists. I thought I'd echo a bit the approach that Satoru had, which is to look at the tasks that need to be performed in the Indo-Pacific, really surrounding Japan's interests, and ask myself, what can realistically the UK and Europe contribute to those tasks? By which is to say, what are the biggest contributions that we can make? Because clearly we can do many things together. We can collaborate in all sorts of ways, but the question really is, where could we actually have the greatest contribution to the key issues that Japan is facing? And I would divide it slightly differently. I also like 3 as the number of the tasks, but I would say task number 1 is deterrence. Task number 2, which you might say is related, but I think is broader, is building up defense industry and defense and capabilities, but particularly the defense industry. And the third key task, alongside Satoru and Guibourg, is regional diplomacy and rulemaking. So if we look at those 3 tasks, what do they need? I mean, on deterrence, the biggest contribution to deterrence, it seems to me, is the signals, the political signals, the messages that you're able and willing to give. And I think if we look at what the UK and Europe can do in terms of signals, it is limited, and we should be realistic about how strong our deterrent signals are able to be. We have theoretical capabilities in the region, particularly France. We have messages that we're sending through freedom of navigation operations. But the key message is, would you take part in a war over Taiwan? Japan can't say yes. So do you think the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and others could say yes? The answer is no. And I think as we have to be realistic about what signals we're willing to give and can give, subject to public opinion and politics, but also, and that's related to deployable capabilities, where also we are very much a secondary, tertiary, or at least at the moment. And we couldn't, the lesson of Ukraine perhaps is that speed of response is vital. And while I think it's pretty likely that the Ukraine war tells us that Europe, UK, and others would respond in an increasing manner to a protracted conflict and would come in later, in the crucial first weeks and months, we would be pretty absent. So it's pretty difficult, I think, for us to see us as a deterrent force. Where we could have a deterrent effect is actually on the United States and perhaps on Taiwan, since it's a 3-way task of deterrence, deterring the US from provoking or even deliberately, preemptively starting a war over Taiwan, which is not inconceivable, even if I'm not saying it's likely, but it's an issue. The way in which Taiwan and US-China plays in US politics is a very important variable in my view. So we do both, Europe and the UK have strong influences in the US, not decisive, but nevertheless it's there. But of course, all of us are seeking to shape Taiwanese politics and Taiwanese approach to the cross-state relations. Second, though, task is defense industry capabilities. And I think there we very clearly have a huge contribution that we can make across, because we all have clear gaps in our capabilities. We all need partners, and none of us want the United States to be the only partner available. So it does seem to me that, as exemplified by the Joint Combat Air Project between the UK, Italy, and Japan, shown across cyber collaboration and intelligence collaboration across a number of different countries with Japan, and a lot of other things in the maritime field. I think and between our industries, I think that it's pretty clear that building defense industry and capabilities is perhaps the most concrete contribution that our partnerships can make, and that the UK and Europe, separately or together, can make in building Japan's capabilities, but also then into the third task, helping to build the defense and security capabilities of other littoral nations around the South China Sea, especially, which Japan is very active in. Because I would say, and perhaps following on from Satoru and Guibourg as well, that I think our diplomatic influence and role should not be underrated as a contribution to security in the Indo-Pacific. Clearly, the UK has already got involved in the rulemaking process through the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I've only said that in order to boast that I can, and that I know what CPTPP stands for, though I often couldn't repeat it a second and third time. But we're already involved in rulemaking. That's very supportive of Japan, and a very important, I think, contribution. But also, I think we should recognize that the biggest economic trend in the region is now that Chinese growth is now slower than that of its neighbors. That the big growth story now looks like it's in the other giants of India, obviously India, but also Indonesia and Vietnam, and maybe some others. And that actually, of an optimistic view of the next 10, 20 years, rather in line with what Ambassador Ishii said on your excellent Japan Memo podcast recently about relations with the Global South, is that actually Indonesia will become an extremely important player in the 2030s and 2040s, particularly in the 2040s, and that other countries in Southeast Asia will get economically stronger. And I think we both can collaborate in the diplomatic and developmental task of accelerating that process. And really, fundamentally, in the end, if the South China Sea and the Taiwan position is to be stabilized and made stable for the long term, then the old slogan of ASEAN centrality seems to me to be actually a slogan that needs to actually come to mean something. In other words, that ASEAN play a real role, and ASEAN's not going to play a real role relative to China until it's strong enough to do so. And I think we could look at the task as the UK and Europe with Japan as being our task over the long term of helping ASEAN get stronger and stronger enough to be able to play a bigger role in shaping its own security environment. Obviously, that, as I say, that does include defense capabilities. So I think that we have to look at these three tasks. We do have to be sober about what we can do on deterrence. That principally is governed by whether the American president says that he is going to intervene and prevent a change of the status quo by coercion. We can support that or not, but we should. That's where deterrence mostly happens. And then in the deployable capabilities of Japan and other local nations, but then it's in the other two tasks where I believe we can contribute most. Stop there.
Thank you, Bill. Important point you raise about the importance of US politics as an important variable in all of this. Again, there's many variables to be considered, but that's an important one. And nice that you talked about the UK's contribution to deterrence with defense industrial base reinforcement in Japan, which obviously is an important strategic goal for Japan, and the UK's diplomatic role, and of course ASEAN, another variable that you brought in as well. So some questions. briefly from me, as we're slightly tight on time, and I've got such a distinguished audience here. I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. But Satoru, first for you, you talked about Taiwan and how important this is for Japan, obviously, not least because of proximity. What's the worst case scenario for Japan in the event of a contingency?
Yes. Before I go directly to answering that question, I just want to point out that the prevailing view among expert community in Japan right now is that it's not going to happen anytime soon. But we shouldn't be complacent about it because because Chinese decision making is very opaque and it's hard to find out what's actually going on inside Mr. Xi Jinping's mind. And if you look at history, for example, well, historical analogies are tricky, but Pearl Harbor, the United States never believed that Japan would attack the United States because they believed that Japan has no chance of prevailing over conflict with the United States. And they assumed that if Japan were to attack the United States, it would be the Philippines. And thirdly, there were false alarms about attacking Honolulu, Hawaii, and so forth. And yet this happened. And so that was a strategic surprise for the United States. I don't think we should sort of mirror image our rationality on China. And we shouldn't be complacent about, this is going to be too risky because CCP legitimacy is going to be shaken if they fail to achieve their goals in the short term and so forth. I think that kind of mindset would be necessary in order to sort of bolster our defense capability. Now, given that, the worst case scenario, among Japanese expert community, we've been examining different types of scenarios. Initially, I think probably beginning 2 years ago, we focused more on the sort of all-out full-scale invasion of Taiwan. And then we gradually shifted to a different type of scenario, which was a sort of a blockade type scenario or a soft quarantine type of scenario. One sort of nightmarish scenario, worst case scenario for Japan would be for China to sort of institute a blockade. And we would be forced to make a decision about how to respond to that kind of situation. Now, I mentioned this scenario earlier during my initial remarks. But the political decision for Japan is going to be very tough if the U.S. makes a decision to intervene, and China is saying that if the U.S. and Japan intervenes, they would retaliate with all necessary means, and implying that they could potentially use nuclear weapons. And if that kind of nuclear blackmail is even implicitly made, that's going to affect the Japanese market, I think. Capital flight could possibly happen. Japanese public is going to probably get into a panic and so forth. And it's going to be very difficult to mobilize the public support to respond to a Taiwan crisis. And if that kind of situation arises, then I think it's going to be very difficult for any Japanese prime minister to make a decision in the face of Chinese retaliation to actually support US operations to defend Taiwan. And that would be a sort of a worst case scenario, very difficult when the public is not on board to sort of resist and withstand that kind of coercion over Taiwan and against us as well. So that would be a sort of a worst case scenario that we could happen. Also, obviously, a full-scale attack on US forces in Japan, even Japan self-defense force bases and units in Japan will obviously be a worst case scenario. But one of the vulnerabilities that we have is that if you play war games regarding Taiwan, most of the major bases in the Western Pacific will be wiped out by Chinese ballistic and cruise missile attacks. And that deprives Japan and the United States to wage effective operations to defend Taiwan. And that is another sort of worst case scenario that Japan could potentially face. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Do you want to?
I was only going to come in to add that it seems to me, I can see that from a Japanese point of view, those are the worst case scenarios. We should recognize that really the worst case scenario is World War III. I mean, I believe one should not look at this as if it's likely to be capable of remaining some kind of a local conflict. the central assumption, given that the strategic stakes are so high between the US and China, is that this does become really World War III.
Yes.
And an important assumption as part of that is that nuclear is highly likely or highly possible to be used as part of it.
Yes.
In which circumstance, capital flight is irrelevant to me, you know, and whatever's happening in economies is irrelevant. So the tasks of deterring this are incredibly serious, I think.
I think if we think in terms of outcomes, I think you're right. And if there is this conventional imbalance, as this conflict unfolds, and one of the side that is being forced to sort of back down will be forced into, escalating to
Exactly.
So that's the kind of situation.
Yeah, as a worst case.
Yes, as a worst case scenario, talking from an outcome. Yes. Yeah.
Guibourg, you mentioned Orcas and this sort of tantalizing concentric circles idea. You talk about France and Japan joining this concentric circle. How do you think Japan in particular can contribute within the Orcas framework?
Well, the sort of emerging underlying dimensions. I mean, we've heard about the nuclear submarine one, and that's been, received a lot of attention. But very quickly emerged the idea that there'd be other dimensions to that that would be added to that deal. With cooperation on quantum technologies, artificial intelligence, 5G, 6G, emerging technologies like that. And Japan actually was Abe Shinzo before he passed away. He was no longer before he was killed. He was no longer the prime minister though, but very immediately, almost immediately, once the deal had been announced, he said Japan would be prepared to join on other dimensions. And so the idea of Orcas as a concentric circle structure emerged really quickly. I don't think the French have voiced any interest openly, though I think they'd be interested. Canada has. So far, for the moment, it's not been the idea of. I think the three countries involved want to focus on the nuclear aspect, but quite clearly the Five Eyes relationship is behind it, or alliance is behind it, and so it's very likely that more dimensions will be added onto it, I believe.
Bill, you talked about the importance of ASEAN, strategic importance of ASEAN. ASEAN's fractured, a range of opinions on all sorts of issues. How do Japan and the sort of like-minded partners, what's the best way to try to sort of secure ASEAN's support for the sort of things they want to do in the region, do you think?
Well, I suppose I think that, one, it's a very long game. I mean, I don't think anyone could imagine that you would get kind of tomorrow or next month or whatever an explicit position on any of these sorts of life and death issues that we're talking about. But I think the long game is to make ASEAN confident enough to convert their absolutely understandable, if you like, neutral position, I mean, a fence-sitting position, total avoidance of occupying camps, into a position in which they seek to shape and deter, so they're strong enough and confident enough that either as a group or through some of the stronger elements of it, that they seek to impose themselves security rules and arrangements in especially the South China Sea, in their negotiations with China, in their deployments. I mean, you can see it already happening in military exercises, joint military exercises, but it's so nascent. But I think at the long game that the UK and Japan can play is to help to strengthen those capabilities, to build the defense capabilities, but also seek to accelerate further the economic growth of many of those countries in a way that then blossoms into political confidence that says we shouldn't just be ASEAN that says we seek to avoid conflict by simply agreeing to disagree and doing nothing, and we wait for a code of conduct to be negotiated slowly over many decades with China. Rather, we are an ASEAN that is now able to take a more proactive position. But this is a dream for the 2030s and 2040s, I would say. But that's what diplomats' job is to do, isn't it?
Audience, any questions from you? Please do ask. And as I say, please state your affiliation. Yes, gentleman in the front row.
Johnson, I'm the UK government. We tend to talk a lot about China's strengths, particularly military strengths, and here we are discussing.
Let's get a microphone for you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I was just saying that it's striking that we talk about military strength of China. We tend to talk about, therefore, the military response. We're drawn into that question. I wonder if the panelists would agree, we don't spend enough time talking about China's vulnerabilities. You mentioned it, Sensei, about that. But I think if you combine, as we're seeing, both military, diplomatic, and economic levers of power, which we're seeing the Western countries doing, you can imagine a situation where Europeans who don't send any military forces to the Asia-Pacific actually can make a contribution by threatening to sever their links with China economically. Military powers like Britain and France are doing exercises with Japan. We are signaling far more than just basing. It's all about the performance of those things. But it's the combination, would you not agree, of the diplomacy, military and economic that really matters here. And that's what we should really put together to message to China.
Satoru, you're nodding very vigorously, and Guibourg, you want to come in as well. So Satoru, you go.
Yes, you know, the US government has introduced this concept of integrated deterrence, which is about mobilizing all means of national strength. And I think I fully agree that not only military, but it's actually also economic and also diplomatic measures that need to be undertaken in order to sort of dissuade and deter Chinese use of force and actually coercion as well. We also need to think deeper about, you know, how countries around the world would react to a sort of a Taiwan crisis. I think most sort of so-called fence sitters or global South countries, including Southeast Asia, by the way, they will probably think that even if a conflict were to erupt, China and the United States will continue to exist. And therefore, it's better for them not to take sides. And therefore, they might be sort of discouraged from actually taking a strong position on, for example, economic sanctions. And I think my sense is that I think countries imposing sanctions on Russia is 40-some countries, but it could be maybe less, given the Taiwan status is different in the eyes of many countries and so forth. So we have to come up, if we're talking about economic responses, I think we have to be more creative about how to forge a larger sort of group of countries to sort of discourage China from undertaking that kind of action. But I have no solid proposals at the moment, and everybody's, I guess, struggling to come up with concrete ideas how to deal with this kind of situation.
Guibourg, you wanted to...
Well, I was going to be exactly on that line that Mori Sensei said. Pre-Ukraine, I would have said you're entirely right. Of course, you know, altogether, of course, we can make a difference. Problem is, we were very slow at getting all together on the Ukrainian situation. That you can't expect European countries to be any faster than they were during the war in Ukraine. And the trouble is, we've seen that it wasn't enough once we agreed, because if the rest of the world didn't agree, then it simply was not a game changer. We no longer are a game changer. So that's a big problem we have. Hence, Japan's attempts at reaching out to the global south in the G7. And that's also what underlines President Macron's idea of not antagonizing China, because in any case, you know, the rest of the world's not doesn't follow. And he talks about a third way and balancing between China and the US. I mean, the idea is to do also what India is doing, you know, appeal to all those in the middle who don't want to take sides. So that's where we have a problem.
Paul Madden, yeah. First, I'm being a bad chair, and we're already over time, but it's such a good discussion that I think we're going to go over another 15 minutes. So time for questions. So the microphone, please.
Thanks, Paul Madden. I used to be ambassador in Japan and also in Australia and Singapore. A couple of questions. One around the elections, which are going to be taking place next year. A lot of this discussion is very contingent on the attitudes that the US will take. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how that might change if we saw a less interventionist US administration or a more isolationist US administration. We're also likely to have an election here, and it's possible that the Labour Party might take over the government. It will depend what the electors decide. It may well be that most of their analysis towards the Indo-Pacific will be not too dissimilar to the ones of the current administration because of all the reasons set out in the national security strategies, which led us towards this Indo-Pacific tilt. But some would say that one small part of that tilt has been about a wish to demonstrate an independence of maneuver post-Brexit. And I wonder if you think that a Labour government would feel that same strength of imperative. That's my first question. The second question, if you'll permit, we talked a lot about how Ukraine has been perceived very much in Asia through the prism of Taiwan. And I wonder if you could say, particularly Mori Sensei, what you think China's assessment of the impact of Ukraine, and in particular the way the West has responded to it, has had on their thinking about Taiwan. Thank you.
So, Bill, you mentioned US as a variable, so
I'll do the two elections, and then yes, exactly. And I would just say that there's a third very important election in January next year in Taiwan, which Mori Sensei is much more expert on than I am, but nevertheless we need to take into account. But okay, so I think US politics currently, if you go to Washington, it's characterized by what, during the Trump period, people used to try to talk about something called Trump derangement syndrome, that there was, people were obsessed that everything that was wrong was Trump's fault. Now there's China derangement syndrome. And US politics is like everything, the potholes in the road, the somebody losing the World Series, it's all to do with China. And it seems that while there is, I think, a legitimate, a very real reason to fear that a new US administration and a new Congress might give less support to Ukraine or remove it altogether in an isolationist way, I think there's very little reason to expect that they would suddenly lose interest in China. In fact, I think it's the opposite. And the likelier variable is that by cutting from Ukraine, there basically be an attempt to basically focus exclusively on China as the enemy. If you combine that with a weak China, maybe you'd see then an opportunistic American policy that said the equivalent of moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is now I'm going to declare Taiwan independent or something. I'm not predicting that, but I mean, you could just imagine that there's a variable there. But there is, I think, a likely escalation problem is with regard to China in the US outcome. In the UK, the Labour Party, I think, while obviously they will have to make their trade-offs as far as resources are concerned, my read is that they're pretty much aligned with the position on Japan-UK relations in particular, and the Indo-Pacific in general. So I don't feel that there would be much variable to be concerned about there.
Yes, on China's assessment regarding the Ukraine-Russia war, I think there are probably two somewhat conflicting lessons that China may have drawn. One is that they have to wage a sort of amphibious operations across Taiwan Strait, and Russia's having problems doing an overlap invasion, and that is going to they realize the difficulties of succeeding in a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. That's one lesson. But on the other side, there could be other sort of military/strategic lessons that they may have drawn from the Russia's invasion experience. I think there are maybe five. Number one, effectiveness of nuclear coercion. Second is necessity of cutting off external aid. And third is the necessity of waging a decapitation campaign against Taiwan, because they don't want to see Zelensky arise in Taiwan. And fourth, the necessity of information blackout. They don't want to see Starlink come out and provide internet and information network services during a conflict over Taiwan. I think they want to cut off information going in and out from Taiwan. And fifth, deploying the necessity of deploying a good narrative to justify the invasion. They'll probably say that it was the United States that was aiding so-called independence forces inside Taiwan, and they'll probably use that as a justification to sort of wage maybe a blockade and so forth. So maybe those are some 5 lessons that they may have drawn. And as a result of that, they'll probably think that we won't do the same failure as the Russians did in Ukraine, and we'll probably succeed by overcoming these tasks and so forth. So yeah, that's my view on this issue.
I just feel like stressing the importance of the war in Ukraine in general for China, also for Japan, whose policy to vis-a-vis Russia changed radically and we also saw the new defense guidelines and new defense documents emerging. So a real emphasis, real increase, substantial increase of defense budgets, an increase of defense budgets. I mean, also for France, for the UK. So that's been very substantial as well. It's a war also that changed Europe, I believe, the European thinking. I mean, the idea of cooperation to provide weapons for a country. Also for NATO, reviving NATO, for the world's divides, basically with this global south, which is not a united front, of course, but, emerging still as and the West becoming aware of it, including Japan. And new divides, new lines appearing, like Saudi Arabia now reconciling itself with Iran, Russia paying visits to North Korea, and not the other way around. I mean, just to emphasize the importance has been massive, really massive. And the perception, I believe that maybe that's an issue we haven't talked about yet, non-proliferation and the importance of nuclear weapons has changed radically. I mean, we thought we were protected from that we'd found something through the Cold War, and that nuclear weapons were that formidable deterrent, and we didn't need to think beyond them in a way, and it's all being questioned. So that the impact of this war has been really massive in all those respects. And
thank you, Guibourg. I'm going to take 2 questions together now in the interest of time. One, the gentleman at the front, and then the gentleman in the second row. Please.
Good evening. My name is Richard Powell. I work for a defence and security company. But prior to that, I was a naval officer and a diplomat as well, working for Paul Madden. I'd like to take an industrial perspective on this discussion. Bill, I absolutely agree with your point about deepening the defence relationship between the countries, not least which because it provides a degree of deterrence. But I think diversifying away from a sole dependency on the US, which effectively Japan has at the moment, is important because the US tends to be a retailer rather than a co-creator. And I think this is a really important area we need to move into. Now, you gave the example of the Future Combat Air System and Japan moving into that program. And that is a great example, but that is really focused on the primes. And as a prime, it is easier to move in Japan because you have the financial clout to do that. For the smaller companies, it's much more difficult, and there are significant barriers to entry, not least of which the cultural resistance you have to be established in Japan a long time. So my question is, what's Japan's appetite for changing those barriers to accelerate the deepening the relationships between defense companies? Because it's got to be some incentives for industry to take that leap of faith.
Great question. And just take the second question. You want to? Yeah. Yes, please.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much for the talk. My name is Yuta from the Japanese Embassy, and I think it was very interesting to hear about the Taiwan crisis scenarios and also how the countries are getting involved with it. But Japan is also facing their potential crisis in Japan, the southern territories, let's say Senkaku, and those security issues are always something very urgent for us. So I would ask to what extent do you think the UK or US will be committed when that crisis, and let's say in Senkaku or Southern Islands, started or occurs? Obviously, I think everyone knows that the US has been committed to that those islands are completely under the range of the security treaty, the Japan-US security treaty. But I think it was interesting to hear about Professor Mori's talk about what is the public opinions, what is the Japanese public opinions when the Taiwan crisis happens. So I think we can also think about what is the Americans' public opinions when something happens in Japan. Are they gonna risk their lives about something which is happening like 1,000 miles away from their home country, stuff like that. So I'm very much interested about how do you predict these UK, US, our allies would react in Japan's crisis?
So Satoru, perhaps if you want to take the defense industrial base question, or
In the industry.
you're going to do that. Okay, Guibourg, you go first.
Oh, well, industry, yes. I don't think, I think you point out very rightly that, you know, protectionism, I think, I mean, my PhD was on Japan's defense policy, and I've, you know, not lost that interest. And I believe, you know, protectionism as far as defense goes has been part of the system for 60 years. And it is hard, I believe, to really get around it completely. If you have niche productions which you know, where cooperation can take place, or which can be integrated into wider projects, and I don't think it'd be a problem really, provided, you know, you have the right access, and then maybe the smaller businesses need to be helped. But protectionism, yes, would remains. I mean, you know, and internal logics, and so leading to decisions which are not always optimal, really, for the Japanese system itself and for Japan's defense policy, really.
Did you want to?
Okay, yes. On the Senkaku.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the U.S. government has declared that under Article 5 of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty, you know, Senkaku is included in the area that is covered. So there's a Japanese government, U.S. government's policy to respond to a Senkaku potential Chinese invasion of Senkaku Islands. But as you say, to what extent does the U.S. public appreciate the strategic significance of defending Senkaku Islands? And I think my sense is, I haven't, you know, actually reached out to the U.S. public for a while, but it's going to be very difficult to persuade the United States to get into a conflict with China over uninhabited islands. And when I was doing a sabbatical leave in Washington between 2013 and 15, we initially had to engage the expert community in Washington to come to realize that this issue is important right now. So now we have to, I think, move on to sort of engage the public about what it means if we allow China to alter the status quo at Senkaku Islands by force. And if that actually happens, for example, if U.S. does not intervene because there's lack of U.S. public support, then that's going to, you know, significantly undermine Japanese reliability, Japanese views on the United States. So we have to work on, you know, nurturing public opinion. Secondly, I just want to briefly touch on the industry issue, if I may. The kind of discussion that I hear in Japan is that whenever there's an industry-to-industry opportunity, it's mostly difficult for the Japanese side to engage foreign companies because of the information security issues. And this has been a major issue between Japan and the United States, for example. Whenever there's a sort of a potential project between Japanese and American companies, and the American companies ask their counterpart in Japan whether they have security clearances and whether their, you know, system is fully secured in terms of information security, it's not possible to sort of guarantee the kind of classification and security that is required to undertake a project that deal with sensitive technology. So, so I think it's more to do with hallmark on the Japanese side, rather than, you know, not about reopening up, but having difficulties trying to match the information security standards of foreign companies. And I think this probably applies to also to British and also American companies and so forth. So, yeah.
Yes, that's very important, very interesting, actually, that point raised by Mori Sensei, because I believe Japanese companies will, the Japanese government will pay for the security clearance procedures, you know, all the investigation around it, if the company gets the deal, but not beforehand. So that's a big problem, because if you're going to take part in a bid, you want the security issues have to be raised before you win the bid by the Americans and British and overseas counterparts. So I believe that's a.
I think the whole point here is that the perspective is based on the relationship with America. And actually, we're talking about open to other countries. And I think there's a kind of, I think there's a dialogue being had to understand the relationship with different countries.
No,
For example,
right.
the co-creation point that I think is really important. And it's important to make the relationship with other countries.
I'm just going to chip in to say that I think that there is a door that can be pushed on that. I mean, perhaps it's most clearly exemplified by the fact that Japan's currently seeing the largest greenfield foreign investment in its post-war history, as far as I know, which is the Kumamoto Taiwan semiconductor plant co-created with Sony. And this is, this is unprecedented. This is a vast piece of, investment. So something's changed to mean that this was necessary. Then obviously you're talking about a lot of, smaller things than that, but nevertheless, doors are there to be pushed on, I think.
Yes, that's true as well. If there was opening on both sides and cooperation becomes interesting maybe to both parties. And on the Senkaku, I wondered, there was we haven't talked about the EU much yet. And in the EU-Japan statement of July 23, there was the Senkaku were actually mentioned, interestingly, most unusually. So I just thought I'd mention that. But so I think the EU's been very keen on showing that it saw eye to eye with Japan, and it talks about being worried about what's happening in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and the Senkaku are mentioned.
So I'm going to plead for 5 more minutes, and I've been okay, fantastic. It's because there's a couple of questions coming online, which I would like to just address. One is, I think, this is for you, Guibourg, and I think it's perhaps a straight yes or no question. Is there any chance that President Macron reverses his opposition to opening a NATO liaison office in Japan?
I don't think so.
Okay, that's quick. Thank you. And then one from Simon Shelton here, which is an interesting question. And it would be the final question. Do the panelists believe that Japan is ready to be truly multilateral in its approach to defense? This can apply to many things, such as greater commitment to collective defense, but even in aspects like harmonization of processes, such as security clearances, which will enable greater assurance, which we've talked about a little bit just now, in information sharing with prospective partners. So perhaps start with you, Mori, and then finish with you, Bill.
I think maybe I can address this issue in the context you mentioned Orcas, right? There's this question about whether Japan should or could join the Orcas framework, and I think there are legal issues that need to be probably clear. But overall, I think there's a case to be made about Japan participating in the so-called Pillar 2 working groups, which needs to be moved forward much in a more robust way. But the reason why is that multinational technology sharing or co-development efforts are essentially about US deregulating its ITAR regulations and US allies improving their information security standards. And this is sort of like, sort of an analogy to concluding a free trade agreement. Everybody has to undergo economic reform in order to harmonize their economic engagement relationships, right? And this is happening in the sort of defense, maybe dual use technology area. And Japan, through participation in a multilateral defense technological cooperation framework, should work on its domestic information security and security clearance issues, so that Japan is more fully engaged in that kind of a multinational context. Investing in immature technologies like counter hypersonics and quantum technologies, doing it on a national basis doesn't really make sense. I think it's better for countries to engage in a multi-partnership style to develop and do research on these cutting-edge technologies that have a lot of potential, but is still immature and high risk. And so that's my take.
Thanks, Guibourg.
I thought you said.
I'm sort of going round the arc. So, would you like to? I mean, would you like to answer?
So I'm sorry, I've lost track now.
Is Japan ready to be truly multilateral in its approach to defense?
I think very much so. Actually, Japan's been extremely multilateral in its approach to defense. I mean, from 2007, they've increased their partnerships to an extraordinary extent, building relations, with Australia, with the UK. So that's a lot of that. A lot of that is bilateral, but we see Japan also taking part in more and more multilateral exercises. That's something interesting also with respect to the British and French cooperation, actually, because it does take place a lot in that kind of framework. So yes, I think Japan is indeed seeking to become more multilateral. So in particular, if the US is involved, anything will go basically. If the US is not involved, then it tends to be bilateral. There's little trilateral without the US for the moment.
Thank you, Guibourg. And Bill.
So I'll just finally say, I mean, I think, yes, very much along Guibourg's line. I mean, I think that Japan is becoming more multilateral. Nobody is truly multilateral. So, and Simon bears the scars of the fact that, that they're not, of course, in the defense industry or anything else. But Japan definitely has no choice but to become more multilateral. And we see the evidence here, and now we need to create the story even more.
Just very briefly. First point is, I mentioned about Japan potential participation in Orcas Pillar 2. Since the frontline state for deterring China is going to be probably US, Japan, and Australia, and UK supporting these three countries through a sort of the defense technological framework makes very good sense to me, because interoperability is very, very important. And I think Japan enhancing interoperability, not only with the United States, but also with Australia and UK, that makes a lot of sense when we think about long-term capability development. So I just wanted to add that point. And secondly, when it comes to technology regulation, this is probably in a broader context about economic security, but I think, US Department of Commerce unilaterally makes decisions about, putting out the entity list and, asking other countries to, follow suit. And, but that kind of unilateral decision-making needs to change, I think. If the United States doesn't want to see other countries backfill, so-called backfill, meaning that selling technologies when the United States is withholding, I think there needs to be a joint decision-making by US allies as well. And so I think there's a case to be made, maybe Japan and the UK together should approach the United States about how to, govern technology regulation policies vis-a-vis China. Right now, I think we have Japan and the United States has a 2+2 economic 2+2 framework. And I think there's a potential maybe for the UK to come in and sort of engage in economic security dialogues with the United States through that kind of framework. So that's another sort of a mini-lateral, not multilateral, but mini-lateral approach that Japan could potentially consider. So that's just an idea, that I want to float. Yeah.
Thank you, Satoru. Well, I said at the beginning, this was a sort of dream panel, and you really have been absolutely fantastic. So thank you. Big focus on Taiwan, obviously. I was struck by Bill's, obviously, World War III. I mean, that's how serious this could be.
Sure.
How protracted a conflict would be, what the UK and France and others can do in terms of helping to build Japan's defense industrial base. Diplomacy was mentioned as well, but one of the sort of key takeaways for me is the importance of public opinion and engaging the publics, not just in Japan, but also UK, France, US, everywhere, and just how high the stakes have been. And I think this conversation we've had is hopefully will serve to that end. So panelists, you were absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, audience, for your great questions as well. And of course, thank you, Japan House, for letting us go wildly over time. So apologies for that, but letting us use this nice venue. We'll be putting a recording of this event on the IISS website, I think in the sort of next day or so. So if you want to have another go at this, it'll be up there for you to look at. But please give our panelists a well-deserved round of applause for their insight.